In 1889, a photographer in rural Pennsylvania captured what seemed like an ordinary portrait. A young boy named Samuel stood in his family's parlor, holding his favorite possession. It was a hand-carved wooden toy car, polished to a shine by his father's skilled hands. Samuel's smile was bright, his eyes full of life. The photograph should have been nothing more than a sweet memory of childhood innocence. But when modern historians began digitizing old photographs for preservation, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. The archivist working on the photo decided to zoom in to capture every detail. That's when he saw it. In the polished surface of the toy car, there was a reflection. But it wasn't the photographer with his old camera. It wasn't the Victorian parlor. The reflection showed something impossible, something that shouldn't exist in 1889. What historians found in that tiny reflection would reveal a dark secret hidden for over a century. Dr. Alistair Finch had spent 15 years working as an archivist at Whitmore University. His job was to preserve history, one photograph at a time. On a rainy Tuesday morning, he began cataloging a collection from the Hartley estate. The estate had been abandoned for decades, and the university had acquired its contents for their historical archives. Most of the photographs were typical of the era: family portraits, landscapes, formal gatherings. Then Alistair found the photograph of Samuel. The boy couldn't have been more than 7 years old. He wore his Sunday best, a dark jacket with brass buttons. His hair was neatly combed, but what caught Alistair's attention was the toy car. It was beautifully crafted, with tiny wheels and intricate details carved into the wood. The surface had been polished until it gleamed like glass. Alistair placed the photograph on his high-resolution scanner. The machine could capture details invisible to the naked eye. It was a standard procedure for archival work. As the scan completed, Alistair opened the file on his computer. He zoomed in to examine the craftsmanship of the toy. The carved details were remarkable. Then he noticed the reflection on the polished hood of the wooden car. At first, he thought it was just a blur, but as he enhanced the image, the reflection became clearer. His hands began to shake. The reflection showed a room that was definitely not from 1889. There were fluorescent lights on the ceiling. Modern equipment lined the walls. And there, barely visible but undeniably present, was the figure of someone in a white lab coat. They appeared to be looking directly at Samuel through the reflection. Alistair's first thought was that this had to be a mistake. Perhaps someone had tampered with the photograph. Maybe it was a double exposure, a common accident in early photography. He called his colleague Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic imaging expert. Sarah had worked with law enforcement to detect forged historical documents. She arrived within the hour, skeptical of Alistair's claims. But when she saw the enhanced image, her expression changed. She ran the photograph through every test she knew. Chemical analysis of the paper confirmed it was from the 1880s. The photographic emulsion was consistent with the period. There were no signs of tampering or later additions. Sarah worked through the night, checking and rechecking her results. By morning, she had reached an impossible conclusion. The reflection was part of the original photograph. It had been captured when the picture was taken in 1889. But how could a modern laboratory appear in a photograph from the 19th century? The two researchers knew they had stumbled onto something extraordinary, or something terrible. Alistair began researching the boy in the photograph. Property records showed that Samuel lived with his father, Edmund Blackwood, in a house outside Philadelphia. Edmund was known in the community as a brilliant but reclusive clockmaker. He rarely left his workshop, and fewer people visited. Samuel's mother had died in childbirth, leaving the boy to be raised by his strange, obsessive father. The records revealed something heartbreaking. Samuel died just 3 weeks after the photograph was taken. The death certificate listed the cause as a sudden fever, but there were no other details. No doctor's notes. No record of treatment. The boy had simply fallen ill one morning and was dead by nightfall. The local newspaper had run a brief obituary, mentioning only that the clockmaker's son had passed away unexpectedly. Curious about who had taken the photograph, Alistair tracked down the photographer's records. His name was Josiah Mills, and he had operated a small studio in Philadelphia. Most of his work had been destroyed in a fire years later, but Alistair found references to a collection of his personal papers in the state archives. After days of searching, he located Mills's private journal. The journal entries from 1889 were disturbing. Mills wrote about a mysterious client who had commissioned him for a special portrait. The client was Edmund Blackwood, Samuel's father. But this was no ordinary photography session. Blackwood had provided Mills with a special lens for his camera. Mills described it as unlike anything he had ever seen, made from a crystal that seemed to bend light in unusual ways. In his journal, Mills wrote with a mixture of wonder and fear. He claimed the lens could capture echoes of what is to come. He didn't understand what that meant, but Blackwood had paid him handsomely to use it for Samuel's portrait. Mills noted that during the photography session he had felt deeply unsettled. The air in the room had felt electric. The boy had seemed nervous, constantly looking at his father for reassurance. After taking the photograph, Mills had wanted nothing more to do with Blackwood or his strange lens. He returned it immediately and tried to forget the entire experience, but his final entry about the session was haunting. He wrote that when he developed the photograph, he had seen something in it that made him question everything he knew about the nature of time and reality. Alistair's investigation led him deeper into Edmund Blackwood's past. The clockmaker hadn't always been a recluse. Years before Samuel was born, he had been part of a secretive group called the Temporal Society. This small collection of scientists, inventors, and philosophers met in secret to discuss theories that mainstream science considered impossible. They believed that time was not a straight line, but a web of interconnected moments. The Society's letters and documents had been hidden in the university's restricted archives. Alistair had to get special permission to access them. What he found there was beyond anything he had imagined. The group had been experimenting with what they called temporal observation. They believed it was possible to create windows between different times. Not time travel, but something more like looking through a one-way mirror across the centuries. Edmund Blackwood had been the Society's most brilliant member. His clockwork mechanisms were more than just timepieces. They were attempts to measure and manipulate what he called temporal frequencies. The other members wrote about him with a mixture of admiration and concern. They worried that his experiments were becoming too dangerous, too obsessive. Then Alistair found the letters about the Samuel experiment. The name made his stomach turn. These weren't the writings of a loving father. They were the notes of a scientist using his own son as a test subject. Blackwood believed he had discovered a way to create a temporal anchor. It was a physical object that could exist simultaneously in two different time periods. The toy car wasn't a toy at all. It was a device, carefully crafted from materials that Blackwood believed could resonate across time. The polished surface wasn't just decorative, it was designed to be a viewing window. Blackwood theorized that observers from the future would be able to look back through the anchor and see into the past. The photograph was meant to document the moment of connection. The Society's letters showed increasing alarm as the experiment approached. Several members tried to convince Blackwood to stop. They warned that the theoretical risks were too great. If the connection was too strong, if the observers did more than just look, the consequences could be catastrophic. But Blackwood wouldn't listen. He was convinced that his son would be remembered as the first human to bridge time itself. Alistair felt sick as he read these documents. The photograph on his desk was no longer just a historical curiosity, it was evidence of child endangerment, perhaps even child abuse. The sweet boy smiling in the picture had no idea that his father was using him in a dangerous experiment. He had trusted his father completely, holding the toy that might kill him. The final piece of the puzzle came from Blackwood's own workshop records. These had been hidden in a false bottom of a trunk in the Hartley estate. The handwriting was erratic, showing a man descending into panic and despair. The entries from the days after the photograph were almost illegible, but Alistair could make out enough to understand what had happened. The experiment had worked, but not as Blackwood had intended. The observers from the future had indeed looked back through the temporal anchor. The reflection in the toy car proved that. But they had done more than observe. Whether intentionally or accidentally, their observation process had transmitted something back through the connection. Blackwood described it as a form of energy unlike anything known to 19th century science. This energy had flowed through the temporal anchor and into Samuel. The boy had seemed fine at first, playing with his toy as any child would, but within hours he had begun to feel ill. Blackwood's notes described symptoms that didn't match any known disease. Samuel's temperature had spiked and dropped randomly. He had complained of seeing strange lights. His body had begun to shut down in ways that defied medical explanation. Blackwood had frantically tried to destroy the temporal anchor, but it was too late. The connection had already been made. The damage was done. His son died in agony, killed by forces from a future that shouldn't have been able to touch him. The final entry was just 2 words, repeated over and over. My fault. The truth was more horrible than anything Alistair had imagined. The photograph wasn't just evidence of a temporal anomaly, it was a crime scene photo. The reflection in the toy car wasn't just proof of time observation, it was the murder weapon. Someone or something in that future laboratory had killed Samuel Blackwood, whether they had meant to or not. The historians who had zoomed in on that photograph hadn't just found a ghost or a glimpse of the future. They had found evidence of the first murder committed across time. The innocent boy in the photograph was a victim of his father's ambition and the careless actions of future observers who had treated the past like a science experiment. Alistair and Sarah presented their findings to the university board. The decision was unanimous. The photograph would be removed from public access immediately. It would be studied only under the strictest security protocols. The image that had seemed so innocent was actually one of the most dangerous artifacts in human history. It proved that the past could be observed from the future, but more terrifyingly, it proved that observation could kill. The photograph now sits in a climate-controlled vault, accessible only to a handful of researchers. Every person who sees it experiences the same chill when they understand what they're looking at. The smiling boy. The toy that isn't a toy. And in that tiny reflection, the killers who didn't even know they were killing. Some historians argue the photograph should be destroyed. They say it's too dangerous, that it might inspire others to attempt similar experiments. Others insist it must be preserved as a warning. It shows what happens when scientific ambition overtakes basic human decency, when a father's desire for discovery matters more than his son's life. But perhaps the most unsettling question remains unanswered. If the observers in that future laboratory could look back at 1889, and if their observation could affect the past, then who were they? When were they? Are they in our future, looking back at us through other temporal anchors we haven't discovered yet? Or were they from a timeline that no longer exists, changed by the very act of their observation? The photograph of Samuel Blackwood forces us to confront a terrifying possibility. The past isn't safely locked away. It can be reached, touched, and changed by futures we can't imagine. Every historical artifact might be a window, every reflection might show more than we expect, and sometimes when historians zoom in to examine the details of history, they find evidence that history is examining them right back. What do you think the figure in the reflection was doing? Let us know your theory in the comments. If you found this story chilling, be sure to subscribe for more secrets hidden in history. Thanks for watching.